Welcome to AP European History with Mr. Bobby. Today we'll be discussing Section 2 of Chapter 18, Towards a New Worldview, specifically talking about the Enlightenment and the later Enlightenment. As always, we'll be using the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text, 7th edition, and off we go. Foundations of the Enlightenment, which follows up this idea of scientific revolution, or really works hand in hand. The Enlightenment is really summed up by really creating a new worldview and shaping the modern mind. And it's something that we need to think really deeply about because we have to really dive back into the text and understand and really think about what the human mindset was prior to this. And it's very tough because ultimately we are all a product of the Enlightenment. The skepticism that you bring to class every day, the questioning, the ideas of freedom, the senses of life and liberty, all of those things. And a lot of times we tend to overdo the idea that the Enlightenment was just a political movement because from very early on in your education in the United States, you get the sense that these Enlightenment thinkers are responsible, completely responsible for, our ideas of independence and Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And while that's very true, it's a much, much bigger movement, more of a revolution in the mind and in thought than it is a physical, actual rebellion. Than it is simply just a political movement. It is a changing and a turning point in people's view of the world. There are three central concepts in these foundations of the Enlightenment. Rationalism, or reason, the idea of proving things, and that this goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution, that science can be used in the study of human nature and society as well. Social science, this is where we get what we are doing now, the idea of history and anthropology and philosophy, psychology, sociology. These scientific laws were used and applied to society. And progress, the belief that it was possible for human beings to create better societies and for people to become better than they were. That we are just not stuck into being one thing. It was very secular in nature. Obviously, it brings up many direct conflicts with the church. And it had an impact on the aristocracy and the middle class, but not really necessarily on the poor and the peasantry. The emergence of the Enlightenment was a broad intellectual and cultural movement, and it gradually matures by about 1750. But it really, while most of these ideas are assembled fairly early on in the 18th century, it doesn't take, it takes quite a long time in the 18th century for all of these ideas to really hit the public with full force. It was popularized by great authors, and what they did or are responsible for doing is taking the gap between science and the educated elite and reducing it and connecting people. One of those most influential writers, Bernard de Fontenelle, his text, Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, communicates science understandably, brings science into conflict with religion, and stresses progress. And this was very significant. Other authors that we need to take a look at. Pierre Bayle, okay, he was a French Huguenot. He despised Louis XIV and all of the religious persecution that the Huguenots faced, and he wrote a historical and critical dictionary. He was a skeptic, and he stressed open-minded toleration, not only of religion, but understanding of all aspects of society. Travel literature is another very key component, and there's nobody that's specifically given credit, but just the realization that there is an outside world, and there are reasons that people in Europe had long hair and very little facial hair, and that people, the Ottoman Turks, had shaved heads and lots of facial hair. That's one example given in your text. But just really an enlightenment and a realization that ideas in Europe were relative to Europe, and there was an outside world. The ideas were not absolute, okay? That meaning they were not definitive of everywhere in the world. And travel literature really opens this up. Another that we talk about, very important in influencing our own country, John Locke. And in this part of the chapter, they talk about his essay concerning human understanding, the tabula rasa, which means the mind is a blank slate, that human beings may face and seek redemption. By 1715, most New World ideas had been assembled, as I mentioned before, but they wouldn't really be embraced until revolutions are occurring or getting ready to occur in the Americas and in France, and they really wouldn't hit the public until that point. And this is when we get the time of the philosophes, and philosophe is French for philosopher, and that's really where we need to base a lot of Enlightenment thinking. And it does spread, and we'll mention a few other gentlemen and a couple of ladies who derive their ideas from other parts of Europe, but France is really a leader in the Enlightenment. For one, French was the international language that was kind of established. It is the center point of culture, the most populous European country. Another reason, French government and religion, although they were still very oppressive, were slightly more open, definitely more open than Eastern European countries, and it gave some wiggle room for these philosophes to work. And finally, French philosophers themselves. They were not content. They wanted to reach the public, and they were very sincere in their efforts. However, we do need to keep in mind that, as your text shows, most of these people, although they are enlightened, were still talking about, as your text calls it, the public versus the people. And the public were still a very small percentage of the people. Most philosophes still felt that the people themselves were wretched souls, meaning the lower classes, the largest makeup of society, and that they really could not or did not possess the ability to understand and comprehend these grandiose ideas. And this is something that we need to realize when we are talking about who exactly the people were that were influenced by the Enlightenment and who Enlightenment thinkers were thinking about and philosophizing about. Philosophers were deeply committed. There was certainly in France as well as in other places not going to be tolerance for speaking out against the state or the church. So most of them are given credit with creatively disguising their masterworks in plays, novels, dictionaries and encyclopedias and in histories. Now for a list of names that will seem to go on, and those of you that are good at rote memory, memorization will do well with these. Montesquieu, he writes the Persian Letters, which is a social satire, and the Spirit of Laws. And Montesquieu is who we would give credit for the idea of separation of powers. He believed that it was not healthy for one individual or one group to hold power, but that many entities needed to, and this is where we derive our idea, our system of checks and balances. Voltaire, who is given credit in your text as perhaps being the most influential or the most representative of the French philosophers. He disliked religious intolerance, constantly and challenged injustice and inequality before the law. However, he saw Louis XIV as a very distinguished ruler of his time, and he wrote The Age of Louis XIV. In his early years, he was in a lot of trouble. He was jailed for a while, and he doesn't really get to do a lot of his primary work and his thinking until he meets Madame du Châtelet. Okay, and she had a husband, but she invited him to live on her estate. She was very well to do, and they were friends until her death. And then he moves on, and we'll get to that in the latter part of this chapter where he goes next. Talking about Madame du Châtelet's influences or her contributions. She translates Newton's Principia, and she is very representative of a handful of women philosophers who have a harsh reality that they are discriminated against because of their sex. The next part of this section talks about the encyclopedia, the very first encyclopedias, which were heavily read. Jean Léron d'Alembert and Denis Diderot. Okay, and these two gentlemen are responsible for really writing the first volumes of the encyclopedia. If you read carefully, it gives you a rundown of how difficult it was to accomplish this. The first edition specifically was put on the list of banned books by the Catholic Church. There's still a lot of resistance to the ideas of the Enlightenment. As the later Enlightenment comes up in the latter part of the 18th century, we find some disintegration in ideas, which is very disappointing. There are many of the later Enlightenment thinkers that are trying to seek their own path, make their own mark, and they are considered much more rigid and dogmatic, meaning that their truths are undeniable. Of these that are mentioned in your text, de Holbach, who writes The System of Nature, he was a very aggressive atheist, determining that people were machines determined by outside forces. And also David Hume, who really attacks reason and the idea of using reason to settle disputes and arguments. And he asserts that the human mind is nothing more than a bundle of impressions. Both of these gentlemen really put the Enlightenment upside down in the attacks that they make, and really try to set their mark in the later Enlightenment. Following their footsteps, the Marquis de Condorcet, who writes The Progress of the Human Mind, and this is a little bit more positive, but he asserts that there are 9 stages of human progress, and the 10th would bring perfection or utopia, or perfect world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we are also very familiar with from our own political science studies, writes The Social Contract, surmising that the general will of the people is sacred and absolute. He is responsible for greatly influencing the early Romantic movement, which we'll get at right down the road. And that concludes this section for you. We'll still talk about some public opinion in the next lecture, but really a lot of names, a lot of key texts. I would focus more on the names and key ideas, and overall a general spirit of what the Enlightenment truly was. Not just a political movement, not just a philosophical movement, but really a changing and a transformation of minds of the general population. When I say general, I mean the upper middle class to the aristocracy, essentially.